You're listening to the 2022 Nelson Arts Festival Pukapuka Talks. This session, Beyond Belief, features Anke Richter in conversation with Noelle McCarthy.
Kia ora tātou. Nā mai, haere mai, ki te whare nei, this beautiful space. Ko Noelle McCarthy tēnei. And it's my pleasure to be with you this afternoon. It's my first time here in Nelson for Pukapuka Talks. And what a book and what a writer we're here to talk about this afternoon. We'll have an hour and we'll use it all, but we will try to leave some time for some audience questions at the end. We'll leave 10 minutes. Many of you here will already know our guest and be familiar with her work as a foreign correspondent and an author and a journalist. She works on stories that are published not only here in Aotearoa, but all over the world, covering issues that span the globe. And she's a trailblazer in terms of the communities and the specialized subject matter that she's investigated in this new book, her new work, Cult Trip, exploring cults and how they work, who joins them, and the devastating impacts they can have on people's lives. And this kind of work, speaking to survivors, collecting testimony, which is often given at great personal cost and after years of silence, it's work that takes a lot of effort and a lot of delicacy and a lot of doggedness and actually a lot of bravery. So I want to begin this afternoon by acknowledging that bravery from our guest. It's nearly out, the book. There will be advance copies available to everybody who signs a book plate at the end of this session. You'll be able to do that when you come outside. There'll be a table there, and I really do recommend that you get in line to get a copy of this book because it's an incredibly immersive and intense and necessary reading experience. I have many questions about it, but before we start talking, could you please join me in welcoming the author of Cult Trip, local writer, foreign correspondent and reporter, Anke Richter. Oh, kia ora, Anke.
Oh, kia ora, Noelle. Thank you so much.
I'm delighted to be here.
Same.
And, I have so many questions, and I want to talk about the other stream of your journalism as well, which, you've been producing, especially over the last 2 years in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic and the sort of attendant rise in misinformation and disinformation and radicalization, because that's another stream of your mahi that you've been doing alongside this book, and it's frankly extraordinary you've managed to do both. And I think that one strand of work informs the other. But let's just start with the basics. How did you come to a working definition of the topic? How did you decide, for the purposes of your research, what a cult is? Because I know it's quite it's a controversial term.
It definitely is a controversial term, and a lot of people think they understand what it is because we have a sort of a cultural understanding of it or a media understanding of we've seen documentaries and we've seen photos and we've heard of Jonestown and Scientology, but it doesn't mean that most people really understand what actually, not just what happens in them, but what brings people to them and what they can look like. And often cults, I keep saying cults don't really look like cults, if that makes sense. So it's not always about the guru in the orange robe and the people chanting in some kind of weird temple or being in a remote piece of land.
Although it can be that too.
It can absolutely be that. But I think nowadays, if you look around, it's probably more. It could be groups that are from CrossFit to MLMs to yoga schools to new evangelical groups to radicalized anti-vax groups. So that definition, okay, because everyone always asks, so isn't the Catholic Church a cult? Isn't the whole society a cult? Isn't capitalism a cult? And I'm going, nah. If we want to be precise with this definition, best word actually is high demand group. It's what the real cult experts
High demand group. That sounds like family. That sounds like your family.
Yes. And you know what? And in a way, that's exactly what a cult is. A cult becomes a family, so that kind of makes sense, right? So a cult is, I've been trying to work this out. How do we distinguish cults from, for instance, world religions like Catholicism or the Protestant Church? So, of course, in the Catholic Church, no doubt about it, there are cultic dynamics when it comes to covering up sexual abuse, for instance, right? But the difference is in a cult or in a high demand group or high control group, people are sort of bound by their passion for a common cause or for their admiration of a charismatic leader. There's a lot of volunteer work, often financial input, which is volunteer work is also financial input because it means you do a lot of work, you don't get paid. Doesn't always mean that you give up all your belongings. There's a sliding scale of these different cult markers. They're not all the same in every group. There's definitely a high form of control, coercion, and then that can be very sneaky and not so obvious. So it's not like you're always in a compound and there's barbed wire and someone stands there with a gun and you can't leave. Because often I hear this, people say, oh, but if you can leave, then it's not a cult. It's not quite like that. It can be far more subtle, like the social control of what you can say, how you can criticize the leader, maybe even on social media, if they say something obviously very stupid, but you can't question that and say, it actually doesn't make sense of me. If you can't say that because you'll be an outcast and you put yourself outside the group, you could very likely be in a cult. And if we all think about where we've encountered that in our lives, I guess most of us have been in contact with maybe groups that would almost fit that definition.
And one of the things that I think your book does, you talked about control and that idea that we often have around why couldn't you just leave? Why couldn't you just get out? And one of the things I think your book does really powerfully is sort of collapse the difference between us and them when it comes to people who end up in these groups or who join freely and stay for a long time. And that's the thing that's quite hard to get your head around.
Even to say people join a cult, that I would flag that, because technically people don't join a cult. They join something that's been misrepresented to them. It doesn't look like a cult to them. No one goes, oh, that's a really cool cult over there on the West Coast. I want to join it. I mean, to be fair, actually people have joined Gloriavale, but they've never lasted very long from what I know. A handful of people actually joined Gloriavale, but normally people don't join cults. They join something they don't think it's a cult. So, and that's the us versus them thing, right? That we always think of ourselves as we're not the kind of person that would end up or join a cult, right? And that in itself helps cults, and it helps them to thrive, and it doesn't help us to be compassionate and understanding of people who are in cults. So I think it's actually quite a dangerous thing to think, only the weak and the stupid end up in cults. I used to think that for years, always thought, people, the Hare Krishnas, they give free food out in the streets, and then they have these lost souls and they come and they find a new home. Those are the kind of people that end up in cults. It's actually quite the opposite. Cults like people that are successful, that are charming, that have a good social network, that have a career that can bring in money and other people. So that whole stereotype of cult followers, I think we have to really reassess that. Mm-hmm.
Well, we'll get to you and your journey and your evolution, because that's a really fascinating aspect of this, and how honest you are about your own sort of experiences. But what you're saying is a really good introduction to the first cult that is sort of described in Cult Trip, which is Centrepoint, because that's exactly how it started, isn't it? A group of idealistic people who had very high ideals in the 1970s?
Yeah, and late 70s, early 80s. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And they just didn't have ideals. They sort of put their lives and their money on the line for it, right?
It's very typical. I forgot to say that earlier. Exactly. Centrepoint is a great example. People are sort of, there is this transformational aspect as well. There's this transcendent cause, could be religious. I mean, Centrepoint called itself a religion, but that was probably more for tax reasons. They were actually quite...
that's quite canny, isn't
it? It happens a lot, actually. Declare something a religion and you're away from any scrutiny and you don't have to pay taxes. So that's worked well for Gloriavale as well. But I think it's really important with Centrepoint to understand that the people they were utopians and idealists. They were into this new form of therapy, Gestalt, which But
Is,
Potter had
is
actually-
well known and respected all
which
over
is
the
why
world.
there's nothing wrong with Gestalt. But Bert had brought this, Bert Potter, the guru of Centrepoint, late guru of Centrepoint, he brought this to New Zealand from his trip to Stasiland in California and Osho, or then Rajneesh or Bhagwan's commune in India. So these were new things in a quite a backwards country back then, where people, especially when they wanted to get some counseling around sexuality, that wasn't available. There were only churches or, so he was revolutionary on what he brought, and a lot of therapists, the whole Auckland psychology scene, they loved it. They all flocked to his workshop. So it's not like there was this radicalized bunch of people who wanted to set up a commune to abuse children. That was not the goal. That kind of came with the territory of it all.
All right, so what
Yeah.
happened? What went wrong? I mean, you're starting with these incredibly
Right.
high ideals.
That was the question of my book. What
Yeah,
went wrong?
what
right?
went wrong? What
Took me 2
happened?
years and I gave up. What went wrong?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, this is exactly why. Because when I came across Centrepoint, I didn't grow up here. All this happened before the internet, so I wasn't familiar with this at all, even though I'm the age group where I should have known about Centrepoint. So Kiwis, above 40, 50, they've heard about it. The younger ones, not so much, or at least not back then. And I was at a New Age festival, actually, in Australia, and I met this woman who'd been a teenager at Centrepoint, and the commune concubine, she called herself. And she, and this is how I thought, wow, what's that? Oh, she said it was a former sex cult. And my journalist mind, of course, going, wow, this is actually a really big story for little old New Zealand. It's not like so much happens here over the decades, right? And no one's written anything about this. That's weird. Well, I could do that. I could just tell Angie's story. And that's how it all started. And I was maybe a bit naive at the time, not knowing what I was getting myself into. But the question all along was always, why did things go so wrong? Because the people who started off with around Bert, apart from the fact they admired him a bit too much as a guru, and that was definitely part of the problem to start with, but why they wanted to live in a community and what they were into, I could relate to that. It didn't sound that weird to me. Yeah. So
Because
what
they
went wrong?
wanted to live collectively. There was a sort of a utopian vibe, wasn't
Yes.
there? We're all raising our consciousness through Gestalt. We're all raising our kids together. We're sharing our money.
Yeah.
We're sort of turning our back on this disaster of late era capitalism.
And of course, there was a high focus on sexuality from the get-go. And again, that's a big topic in itself, because it was seen as this free love community. But then, where I stand now, understanding more about polyamory, and the last, I think, 10 years or so have really taught us a lot about how to have consensual, ethical non-monogamy. I don't think that's what they did at Centrepoint. No, it wasn't free to start with, and I don't think it was loving either, given what I found out how people were treated, especially those who were abused there.
If you read this book, and certainly if you've read Anke's previous journalism around Centrepoint, there's no doubt of that. There is no doubt, is there, the extent of the damage, especially for women and children. I'm not saying men weren't damaged as well, but young girls were incredibly damaged.
Boys were damaged too, and I think it's still one of the untold stories of Centrepoint that still needs to be told. And often it's harder for boys to admit that. It can take a lot longer. I know of one person who's the son of one of the leading therapists, and it's only been the last few years, probably also through maybe the documentary has come out and some of my work, and he was still in denial when I first talked to him, and I know he's had a mental breakdown in the last years, and because it's very clear to him that what has happened. So, we're talking people who are 40, 50 years old, and they're only now realizing what it really was, what happened to them. But you're absolutely right. In general, in cults, this is why I keep saying cults are a feminist issue, right? We can agree on that. We meet in that. Because most cult leaders, not all of them, but most cult leaders anywhere around the world are male, and more women than men join cults. And sexuality, not just for women, but everyone, any gender, in a cult becomes a means of control, which I think is really fascinating. So even in a very sort of prudish or purist cult, or in cults where you're not even allowed to have sex, so these exist or have existed as well, it's always controlled. There's actually, it's either amplified or it's suppressed or it's somehow controlled, that there is a certain dogma of how it should be done. And at Centrepoint, it was certainly that way. The dogma was you should definitely have more than just one partner. You should always open up your relationship if you came in. I mean, every couple that came to Centrepoint was pretty much pressured to have other lovers. And I mean, it was disastrous. If that's not coming from your own free will and desire, and you have the tools and the communication and the support and everything to do this, even then it can be difficult enough. But it's a recipe for disaster. So throwing sexuality into a group that's already controlled and where there is a guru and where there's so many issues, now you put sexuality in the mix, I mean, what can possibly go wrong, right? Yeah.
Everything goes wrong. It's interesting reading the different case studies that you that you've had in your journalism, Angie and Louise.
Louise, yeah.
Yeah, who, these are heartrending stories. And partly I was thinking, are they so heart-wrenching because so much has changed in the meantime, right? If this is happening in the 70s and 80s in Auckland, in Albany, it's before Me Too. It's before that sort of massive consciousness or sort of cultural shift that we've had around consent, around sort of power dynamics. Reading those stories, they're stories of grooming. Those are young women being groomed, but we didn't really have that word. Maybe if you'd read Lolita, you might know about it, but we didn't have that sort of awareness.
We did not have that awareness, and I have heard that also from one of the people who helped me a lot with this book is Barry Leslie. She's a real activist from Centrepoint. She was a fanatical follower of Bert Potter and the editor of his magazine, and then later completely turned around and helped to bring Centrepoint down with a court case as well. And she really supports the survivors. And that's always what she's told me. She said, well, actually in the 80s, she was a teacher. She said, we had no idea about sexual abuse in children. And if women went to the police station back then, because if they'd been raped, they were asked if they were wearing what they were wearing and why did they go out at night. I mean, that was the culture, right? So, of course, in that environment...
That was the culture 10 years ago,
I know, it's not like it was only in the 80s, right? And the
maybe
other
now...
thing, and the other thing that's also played into the whole awful dynamic of Centrepoint, which is really relevant to me also coming from Germany, because we had the same warped philosophy there. So there were quite a few therapists and psychologists also in the 70s, maybe early 80s, who propagated, and they had their studies, I guess, to some degree, or their research to back it up, that, as they called it, intergenerational sex is not as bad, for children. It's only bad if someone tells them afterwards that shouldn't have happened, and if the social workers then come and mess with their brains. But as long as it's all done lovingly and they're being initiated by an older, by an adult, nothing's wrong with that. So it's not like Centrepoint made that up, and it was kind of brought into their world also by academics, by people who'd visited, or by books they have read. It was rife in the sort of green alternative scene in Germany. Actually, they were members of the Green Party at that time when it just formed, and they had their massive call out about that years later, because it was because they kind of tried to normalize what they called boy/man love under this umbrella of sexual freedom. So it's a big grey area from the 80s to start with, where sexual liberation and then maybe later on consent culture, abuse, everything was still in its infancy. So a group that's so tries to be revolutionary around this without actually really having a clue.
And ends up causing an awful lot of damage. It's the flip side of what you were talking about at the start, isn't it? Like this is the flip side of allowing idealism to dictate how you form your community, how you live as a group.
And that's so conflicting for me because I love idealism. I mean, half of the audience here, I think, are all festival friends from a lovely alternative festival called Convergence that I always go to, for years and years. And I think it's a healthy community, but there is a lot of idealism. There is it comes with a utopian flavor as well of creating a community every year. So that is not that different from what people who started Centrepoint wanted to have all year round, share their resources, co-create something, have honest conversations, have amazing transformative workshops, and have a lot of sex with a lot of people. I mean,
what's not to
what's not
like?
to love, right?
What is not-
No, that doesn't happen at conversions, by the way. Just to make that clear.
So it's next year.
Sorry.
No.
Don't want to embarrass anyone here. But see, I totally get the utopian and idealistic
Yes.
part. And again, this is such a, it's so heartbreaking for me in a way, because in cults, in most cults, it's actually the best parts in us that get exploited, which are the ones that want to, they want more than just to make money and pay off the mortgage and go to the rugby. It's actually people who are seeking, who are spiritual seekers, who want more community, who want to create a better world. And I totally get that idealism. And
Of course you do. I mean,
and in New
that's
Zealand, there's so many intentional communities around here that are wonderful.
but it's also
Yeah.
a very sort of sane and spiritually well response to where we are as a planet right now, right? Like in the 21st century, where we
Right.
look at late era capitalism, where we look at sort of, abuses, climate change, all of these things, you can see why, as well, the sort of retreat of traditional pillars of society, like the church, you can see why, as people who want to be together, like I don't want to be a white woman using that word tribe, because I hate that, but,
too, yeah.
but that idea of wanting to be social and wanting to be belonging. Exactly.
And I get that because, I always thought of myself as a very social being, lots of friends. And then before we moved to New Zealand as a family, we lived on a small atoll on the South Pacific. My husband was the island doctor there. And that sense of community I felt there, I thought, wow, that's possible. And I went to a boarding school in England for a year when I was 16. And again, I think something in me has always longed for that for more community than what our normal lives offer. It's probably really deep. And especially with the pandemic, like you said, I mean, that need wasn't met for 2 years by a lot of people. I mean, we were lucky in New Zealand; we could get together more than in other countries. But it's not surprising for me that so many people fell down these rabbit holes and into these very cultic belief systems around vaccinations, alternative health, and whatnot. It's because they felt that they had a cause, and there are people who understand them, and there's an emotional bond.
All of those things.
Yeah.
Were you very familiar? Did that feel familiar to you, given you were sort of in the thick of this work as well?
Yeah, of course, there's a total overlap that I see. And so I think I was one of the earlier adapters probably in Aotearoa because of my work and because of the groups that I've been in myself or still have a foot in. I was watching the New Agey, neo-tantric, spiritual world quite a bit, and I saw really early on people were posting what they're into, and my feeling was that in New Zealand most people were quite oblivious that this could be a problem here. It's like, team of 5 million, our borders are closed, we got this, we're doing the right thing. Jacinda, shining star internationally, yes, that's true. But the brain virus that still crept in was here, and we've seen this then at the protests in March outside Wellington, and the people who
Brain virus.
Yeah, the brain virus. I mean, it's really sad because so many really lovely people, also from the festival scene, musicians, organizers, you name it. I don't want to throw names around, but even pretty close to Nelson, right? It's sorry. That was a no, okay. Don't need to damage anyone's business further. But but yeah, it was really tragic for me to see, and it's to see that was already happening in the alternative spaces in New Zealand too, just like anywhere in the world. And I remember this moment early on in the pandemic when my husband and I were lying in bed, and we were just so shocked by what we see, friends of ours, and they were sharing the pandemic video and sending that to us, and we're giving them like a measured reply. I can also look, maybe ask Frank, my husband's a doctor, he can tell you what he thinks, or we're just rolling our eyes and our hearts were sinking. And then, I remember that one night when we were looking at each other and we were saying, I mean, this might sound a bit extreme, but we're saying, is this how some people must have felt in the mid-1930s or later in Germany, when they were thinking, wow, what's happened to my lovely neighbors and our teacher, and they're all wearing the brown shirts now, and they're all going to these parades, and they're all into this Adolf guy. And
Well,
Do you
it's
know, I
not
don't know
that
if it's-
extreme in the sense that Nazism was invoked, by people who were protesting at Parliament.
Do you see where I'm coming from? That for me it was always, and I think to go deeper into also in why I wrote this book and why I've been so drawn to this, not just because I love going to festivals and therefore it was close to the bone if people drift into communities that are not healthy, but I think it's also this whole question of almost like collective guilt, or how can people be so misled? How easily can that happen? How can lovely, normal, good people end up in something bad? So that's the bigger picture stuff, right? And I think that applies to when we think of the protest movement and the pandemic and the extreme forms of it like QAnon, if we think of cults and also if you think of Nazi Germany. So that really is the bigger picture stuff.
And a feature of this, because so we start with Centrepoint, we move through Agama, and we'll talk about that. We'll go back and talk about that's a yoga cult in Koh Phangan in Thailand with links back to Osho in India, and super toxic stuff going on there, and then on to Gloriavale here in New Zealand. And, something they're all very different on paper, massively different worldviews, ideas, ideals. But, one thing that brings them together are these abuses of power. And something that I felt was noticeable in all three examples was the extent to which the law and police, the instruments of the law, were at various times sidelined or sort of just not very useful or active. Yeah, I mean, Centrepoint came down in the end because of those court cases, because of a prosecution which was successful. But, the Thai police, not much was done from the, from in this yoga cult. And, Gloriavale, it'll be interesting to see what happens next. What do you think?
Too little too late with Gloriavale too. I mean, it's super interesting at the moment, right? Following the Royal Commission and the court case, and there is more to come. There are more court cases to come. I know of that. So it's not like everything's already even come out. And it's been such a shift, right? And all this comes down not just to police work, this should have all been happening years and years ago. These problems are not new. They're endemic in their culture. But it's actually happened because there's a bunch of volunteers, and they're called the Gloriavale Leaver Support Trust. They're from a church in Timaru, and they're doing this as volunteers with fundraising, and that's often the case. It's often people who've come out from cults who become then activists. They actually need help themselves, but what they often do is that they try and help others, and it shouldn't be that way. So I'm quite passionate about, we need better trained cult counsellors in New Zealand who can really help people come out, better trained, to police, the judiciary. I think, from my understanding, a lot of them don't really get what it means, for instance, for a young Gloriavale woman to be in a court case. So if you're in Gloriavale and you grow up there as a woman, they have the servants and shepherds, these group of men, and they talk down at you like for hours and hours if you've done something wrong. So what you could have done wrong is that you were sexually abused, but it's actually your fault because you were seductive and you were flirty. So they come down hard on you because of that, and you have to maybe apologize to the abuser. So if you've experienced again and again that you don't have a voice as a woman, that you have to be meek and that you don't count and you just have to comply. You're subjugated on a daily basis since you've been a child. So imagine if you find yourself, you're brave enough to, even once you've come out, to go to the police and go through the whole rigmarole of a court case, and you finally make it to court and haven't had a mental breakdown yet. And then you have lawyers from the other side, and there are men in court talking of, going, but you have challenging you.
You have to question whether our adversarial system is going to serve someone in that situation.
Would they even understand that a woman from Glory will just shrink and crumble and just go, yeah, no, whatever, And this is how some of the cases have gone so far. And I'm really passionate about we need to have better cult understanding. Like you said before, we've had the Me Too movement, we understand consent better. I think we understand trauma better now. I mean, the word trauma-informed is being thrown around. I hope being cult-informed becomes a buzzword too. Yeah.
I have to say, I don't think of myself as a particularly naive person, but, reading about Gloriavale, it's there's not a hierarchy of them. They're all terrible. But, you know, Gloriavale in particular, the stories you tell, I mean, just to give more context to what you're saying, one of the people who was in that sexual abuse situation, that was a 12-year-old girl, you know, and some are even younger, you know, what's happening. And you have rigorously and extensively documented this as well, you know, I mean, sort of kudos to your journalism, Anke, because that is really valuable, I think, because that's what we have to go on. But, you know, the extent to which that community is separate from the state in all ways, you know, in terms of how, who's in charge, where the money's going, all of these things. I find that very shocking, you know, to read.
I found that shocking too, and I was one of these people who, you know, like most of us, probably also made a bit of a joke about Gloriavale.
You dressed up.
I even dressed up. I mean, I was already cringing then. That was before I went there for the concert. So
for a party.
Yeah, but I dressed up. No, I actually went to the Gloriavale concert. So after that, I just couldn't take it. I just couldn't make jokes about it anymore. But before that, I did dress up. It wasn't my idea, though, to my saving grace. For a Halloween party, we all went as, you know, people from Gloriavale. So, but that's kind of how it was seen, you know, like a bit of a joke. I mean, it's bad for women, you know, but it's a bit of a joke. That's how it was back then. And I think what's come out since then, and all these things could have been known so much earlier, that in court now, and that talk, and like you said, I've documented it in my book, but it's, I mean, I'm not the first person who's done that. There've been great TV documentaries by Sunday, some great programs where Hope for Christians, abuse, I mean, awful sexual abuse was documented.
Hopeful Christian, the founder of
the founder, right? I mean, there's no doubt about what it was. That's been known for decades, and still they could stay under the radar because there's such a sort of
Is it because
obscurity.
They were religious?
It's because they're religious. It's because there's a sort of a bit of a freak show, so people kind of love them for their cuteness, value, or whatever it is, and the costumes. I think the documentary, if you can even call it a documentary, the TV series about Gloriavale on TVNZ did such a damage to things being done about Gloriavale because it just portrayed them in this as this saccharine world, and people just had this fascination with them. It's been really unhelpful. It's not a documentary, that's propaganda for them, and it's really served them to keep people down. I think the other reason is because, like you said, it's religious. With Centrepoint, even though it took way too long for Centrepoint to go down, and that was also because a policeman was complicit in that, and that's why it took a lot longer for the raids there to happen. But I think it's probably also, in some, correct me if I'm wrong, but maybe in our society it's easier to point the finger at the dirty hippies and think something's wrong there than at the nice, proper-looking Christians, and no, they're just a bit extreme, but they're doing the right thing. And also, what I thought after my first visit there, I thought, wow, this is a deeply, deeply misogynistic cult. Their whole philosophy is built on subjugating women. Imagine in New Zealand, I mean, which is a shocker in itself, right? I mean, we're a female-run country. We're one of the most egalitarian countries in the world. How is that even possible? But still not shocking enough. Imagine Gloriavale would be, their whole philosophy based on the Bible, for some reason, would be that black people or brown people or indigenous people should be subjugated by white people, and that's how their community would be run. Do you think they could just stay under the radar for 10 years? People would just, celebrate them as this obscurity or this freak show, but wouldn't do anything about it? Don't you think there would be picket lines outside and people would boycott their products and their honey and their milk and say, stop this? It's a human... Sorry if I'm on a rant here.
But part of the...
But there are human rights violations on a grand scale going on there, and that's been happening for decades.
But part of the complication of that, Anke, isn't it that, the women who live in these communities are part of these communities. And as you say, it's not about joining the cult, it's about having been born into these communities. And these are not people who want to leave, if you ask them, apart from the ones who do. But, these are women who have sort of taken on the belief that in order to be a good Christian, a good person, I must have as many babies as possible. The testimony in your book I had to take breaks reading this book. I don't know how you wrote it, in terms of I'm not trying to be funny, you had to take breaks too. But there is one particular piece where a woman from Gloriavale is talking about being forced, I don't know if this happened to her or she's talking about it, but being forced to have sex with her husband very soon after giving birth, you know, like hours after giving birth. These moments that you think, how is this happening in 21st century New Zealand, in 21st century Aotearoa?
That was really disturbing for me too. And I have to say, I did that interview, that I didn't interview the woman who that happened to, but she told me about that, right? Virginia Courage, amazing woman. So that was probably the last interview I did for the book, the very end. And I was, at that point, probably a bit over cults after all these years. I just wanted to wrap it all up, get it all done. I thought, okay, I'll just update all my Gloriavale research that I did years ago for various media. And then I met Virginia, and I thought, okay, that's great. That's really, you know, she's involved in court cases, and I had no idea what was coming. And just these 2 hours with her, I really thought I'm entering Gilead, you know, the Handmaid's Tale. And I was literally sick after. It was like I needed a hot shower. It was just in my system. It really reminded me of how I'd felt again and again after interviewing Centrepoint survivors. It wasn't that different. It wasn't that different at all. And I just thought, wow, this is the same. This is just, she's grown up in this world. She's gone through so much. The stories she told me about how, especially the women, how they have to be sexually available around the clock. And you can't even really blame the men for that because they don't know better either. So what you said before about people who don't even want to leave, and I thought, well, I mean, there are stories, I think, also of people who went into prison, like really at a young age, and they've been in prison all their lives, and they can't function outside anymore, and they want to go back.
Yes.
Because that was their safe. It's almost like their sort of safe crate.
They're institutionalized.
They're institutionalized, and it is like that. It's the same like that. And people people really struggle who come, especially out of Gloriavale. It's like another country, and not even a Western country. It's like a country from another planet.
Well, I mean, they call North Korea the hermit kingdom, but you know,
that's a good comparison.
It's right here.
So they really, but you couldn't tell when you saw them in the streets, and they wear normal clothes again, and they have a bit of a dialect maybe, but they speak English perfectly, and they look like us. And
I guess the sinister bit as well.
Yeah.
You referred to it. You know, they're not making any trouble. You know, they're quiet. Mm-hmm. Everyone's working, as you say. You know, they're religious. I thought the interview. There was a certain politician you interviewed, Tony Cockshorn, and I found that quite chilling. That testimony from him, you know, saying I've never had a problem with them because they're good farmers, and you know, and I think that's the value of this work, because these testimonies from women especially haven't been heard before. I mean, that must be the other thing. Do you think that's quite weird, you know, that you've come here, you didn't grow up in New Zealand, and maybe it's the outsider's eye that you've looked at some of this stuff and gone, hang on, that's weird. Why haven't we talked about that more?
I mean, it has been done by other journalists too, to be fair, and there have been stories about Centrepoint survivors as well, and some of them were survivor focused. But I think even that concept, survivor focused in journalism, didn't really exist back then, and I actually had to learn all this as well. So it's not like I'm the first person who goes and says, oh my God, women have suffered in New Zealand cults. Let's talk about it. I think it's more sort of come up through the course of my work, especially when I pulled it all together, and I made this connection of actually Gloriavale as a sex cult too, because they control the sex. Not that, I mean, some of you might be surprised to hear this. It hasn't been so much in the public domain yet, but they're very focused on sex.
I thought John Campbell did really good sensitive
he
work
did,
around
right?
that,
yeah.
because
so it's only to lately come out, right?
And he looked, but I also think there's. Isn't there often a tipping point in cultures? You know, that is how Me Too happened. You know, it wasn't that it was just one testimony. Suddenly it was all of these stories.
Mass, right?
And you have a critical mass.
Yes.
Exactly. And that's what this feels like to me. You know, this feels like a critical mass that's been developed over time.
And also, don't forget, we're in this sort of golden era of cult revelations. So when Wild Wild Country came out, and then The Vow, and all these cult documentaries, everyone loves a good cult story now. You know, they've become very topical. And there is there's a flip side to that, because they can just become sort of, tabloid fodder. But I think the reporting about cults has also changed, and just this, even that word, trauma informed and survivor focused. I've learned a lot through my years. I've made many mistakes in the beginning. I was not aware of what I was getting myself into, and certainly I wasn't trained for it. It's not like I've been briefed by psychologists of how to speak to survivors of sexual abuse. I just fell into that. And you mentioned Louise before. She's I would say, one of the most severely violated kids from Centrepoint. I mean, she's over 50 now. She has never in her whole life told anyone her story. I was the first person. And it was life-changing for her, and it was life-changing for me. And I was not equipped to really to handle that. So over the course of all these years where I was so in the Centrepoint, cesspool, and what it did to me, I had no help really, especially not. I did go and see a therapist, actually when it was probably too late. But now looking back, I think I would have. This is why when I wrote the second attempt of this book, so there was an original book which was just about Centrepoint, and I actually had to kill it in the end and stop, just to look after myself. And then on the second round with this book, I did it differently. I had a team of people who were my core group and supported me. One of them was the wonderful Carrie from the festival here. And I made sure I went and saw a therapist regularly. I made sure I knew when to take breaks. I knew the signs of my PTSD, which I actually had from that first round of work, right? I knew what that felt like. I thought, okay, time to go for a swim and watch a nice movie, and not even think about cults for maybe a few days or so. Right?
And that's I'm really glad you're talking about that, because I think that's, like, from a media point of view, the thing that comes to my attention about you, Anke, as well as the excellence of your work, you're freelance.
Yeah.
You don't have a big institution. You don't have a TVNZ or a Stuff or an RNZ or anyone else behind you.
I have no water cooler. I don't have colleagues. I don't have. Nowadays, which is great, is Stuff or some. I think also the Herald, most media organizations these days, especially since the mosque shootings in Christchurch, I think, they give their reporters supervision.
Yeah.
Yeah. But that wasn't. I never got that, and I definitely. Came too close. I'm not the first journalist who's encountered that, but I didn't really know, the boundaries are so blurry anyway, because I guess some of the value or quality of my work is because I got so close, and because I was sort of, I got into people's lives and their minds, but that comes with a risk, obviously, right? And if you haven't learned professionally, like a therapist or a policewoman or so, where to, basically have that perspex glass, to a boundary, right? The boundaries got really blurred.
Yeah, and that makes for great reading. Let's be honest, that makes for a great book, because there's moments, especially, definitely the Centrepoint stuff, around your relationship with Louise, who's, this woman in a caravan in West Auckland, who's so damaged. But let's talk about yoga and tantra, because that's fascinating for so many different reasons, right? And you're very honest about your own position, the liminality of your position as a participant, and because you're not an objective observer, you're not.
I doubt that anyone really is.
Yeah.
Your personal biases and your personal experiences, your life always colors what you're looking for and who you're talking to, and as much as you can only try to be as factual, but I think this is not just a factual book, it's also a book of how I went about it and where I failed, or
But I think that adds, as someone who wrote a whole book and then got the horrors, because I realized how completely subjective, I'd been about something that maybe should be objective. Memory is fallible, but I think in your book it adds a deeper layer of empathy, I think, because of your participation. You're very good on sexuality. You're very good around, you ask a question and I'll ask it back to you. How come it is in this area of, sort of a healing around sex, that even when they're not cults, how come it's so open to abuse?
Absolutely. Actually, I've just published an interview about that in a German newspaper last weekend, so it's very much on on my mind, where I interviewed 2 sex therapists who've done sexological body work themselves, and one had been a tantra massage person. And that whole field is, I mean, the potential for abuse is huge. And again, I have to always say this with a disclaimer. The potential for good stuff is also there. It's actually, in fact, in every cult as well. Every cult has something good to offer. No one would go there in the first place, right? If there wasn't something in it that can be great at first, maybe. So this whole neo-tantra scene, the spiritual scene, the conscious scene, a lot of it is here in the Bay, in Golden Bay as well, in New Zealand in general, the festival scene, alternative healing, and so on. Look, I mean, I've been a participant in that for many years, and probably quite evangelical about it. Now that I told people that I see the shadows, I say, "Oh, Anke, you always wanted us to join these courses." Oh, cringe. I was one of these people. I try to recruit people into my group. No, seriously, I actually did. So I'm no different, really.
But you wouldn't have done that unless you had the best intentions, I imagine.
Yeah, but it's the same for people who went into Centrepoint and wanted others to come with them and put all their money in. They all had best intentions. Maybe not Bert Potter, but I would say the people who followed him, they all had good intentions to start with. I mean, yeah, that's why it's so difficult. And to come to the whole yoga and especially, yoga has been rife with abuse from the get-go. Some of the biggest yoga gurus in the world who've
That's the yogi ringing. On a point of order. Yeah.
Someone from above is saying, do not talk about that. You never know. That's the thing. What's baked also into the yoga culture, I think, and also into a lot of spiritual groups, and that's where where the issue really is what is called spiritual bypassing. And the whole sort of gaslighting around that. That means if you have a problem with how you're being treated, or someone was transgressive, whether they meant to be transgressive or not, but you're not comfortable with something, but if you bring it up, especially if there has actually been abuse, sexual abuse or any kind of abuse, and you bring it up, and then you're told, look, this is, first of all, you might be told, well, have you looked at what it is inside you that has attracted that? For me, that's just like...
Well, there's echoes of Gloriavale there, aren't
there? Absolutely. So it can come from like very new agey stuff like law of attraction, and it's also come from Christianity. It's across the spectrum. Then it can be look, here's an opportunity for you to work this out with the other person, and why don't you and then you can both heal together or something like that. Which again, I guess anyone here who's a therapist or understands anything about counseling and consent and so on, no, you don't just bring the abuser and the victim together and let them work it out. That's not how we do it in this century in New Zealand, right? And then then there's this whole thing of what have you done to bring? Oh, and if you're a really spiritually evolved person, you just open your heart more and you rise above that, and you don't even make it's basically don't make a fuss if you're a good spiritual person. And I mean, there are different sort of schools of thoughts that come together, and that even, I must say, even with the Gestalt therapy, there's a bit of that in there sometimes too. It's always your stuff. You always got to, if you have a problem, I mean, it's good to look at yourself
and
first,
again, that's
right?
tricky, because that is true. Yeah. I'm just keeping an eye on the clock, because I want to leave enough time. But look, Tantra, first of all, right? Like, what
can we just say Neo-Tantra here? Just to
Neo-Tantra,
correct.
Okay.
I know we always say Tantra, but
I remember when what's happened with Tantra, because I remember when Tantra was a punchline, like Sting was the only one doing it,
and that's actually bullshit, because he never did it.
Okay,
he just said that, and it's actually his wife retracted that years later, said actually we never had tantric sex. I don't even know what that was. He just said that in an interview because it made him sound like a sex scholar that he had sex for 9 hours. It's not true. No, I mean, look, how many more hours have we got to explain what Tantra is? But I think let's just say Neo-Tantra and all this sort of conscious sexuality movement, which is really big in New Zealand. We've got groups here like ISTA and festivals and the Eden Festival and whatnot, and I'm not a fan of them anymore, I have to say, because I was for a while. And I think there is a lot of potential for sexual abuse, for transgression, for re-traumatizing people, for not respecting people's boundaries, because also you often come in there with this expectation of, I've paid money for this, I'm going to be transformed. If I don't get with the program and do what everyone else is doing that, even though it's a bit extreme and a bit full on, and oh my God, I should get naked now, where I actually didn't know that was going to happen on the first day, then you're the boring one, or you're not really getting it, and you're not going to get your money's, you're not going to get bangs for your bucks in the end and come out as this transformed person. So it's kind of systemic almost.
But it's that dynamic that plays on human nature, doesn't it? I mean, there've been experiments done in various psychology departments, to show that sort of we get social cues and we don't want to transgress. We don't want to be the one with her bra still on if everybody else is taking their
You've been there.
Not yet, but I'm open. All of these things touch on sort of fundamental parts of our human nature, don't they?
Takeaway from the book, I think, is really there is no us versus them. Yeah, the cults do that. Cults really build an us versus them, like we're the chosen ones and the world out there is bad and dangerous. But let's not do that in reverse. People in cults are no different to you and me and all of you. And I think and actually the same is also true with a lot of people falling into the more radical anti-vax beliefs and so on. Yeah, if we don't just see them as the others, but if we can, keep a connection from the heart and understand that we could have ended up in this place with a different education, a different skin color, a different experience at some point in our lives with the medical system, or just have compassion. So yes, there's a lot of investigative journalism in this book, but I think it's also compassionate journalism, and so that's what I want to stand for. Yeah.
Would anyone like to ask any questions? I've talked for too long, but there is 5 minutes left. I think there's a mic. Oh, we don't actually have time for comments, only questions, if anyone has any questions.
But ask a question, please, Lois.
Is that on? You've talked a lot about sexuality, quite rightly. One of the things about Centrepoint was the drug use there. Would you like to comment on that, please?
Oh, for sure. That's another topic, and again, it's actually happening more and more now in some of these neo-tantra spaces, shamanic schools and so on, that there are psychedelics in the mix as well. And actually, Centrepoint did that really early on. And again, it wasn't just to get high and have a crazy time. It was actually seen as a human potential, a part of the human potential movement, because Bill Potter had been at Stasiland, and they were the pioneers of the psychedelics movement. Again, amazing work with a lot of carnage, by the way. But Bill Potter brought this, this is where he got those ideas from. And there was a lot of, these ideas were quite rife at the time, that by taking, this is actually how ecstasy was, in MDMA, was a substance that was used in couples counseling first. So people would open up and hopefully fall in love again and talk. But then he later used it actually basically to drug rape young women in the community and teenagers, because once he became a bit more of not an outcast, but there was opposition against Bird as well, and he was pushed out a bit, and he lived more on the outskirts. And the way he could still get his way with the girls was by having therapy sessions with them, one-on-one sessions. So one of them was Angie in my book. So it actually became drug rape, what he did in the end. But the drugs were their downfall. So with the sex abuse alone, the raids wouldn't have happened the way they've happened. They had to come in first with the drugs, and then they could
it's like the labour laws in Gloriavale, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a bit like then they could get the leaders out, and then that was the first sort of round of arrests, and then they could come in again with the sexual abuse. So the drugs are a really big part of the Centrepoint saga, yes. Mm-hmm.
I'd like to ask you about denial. You talk about the young man who's in denial. One of the outcomes from Centrepoint was Dr. now Professor Felicity Goodyear-Smith.
Yes.
And the denial of recovered memory. How much do you think that official denial of recovered memory has affected the medical and the police response to continuing cover-up of the abuse of children?
That's a really big question. I'm probably not really super qualified to answer that, and I have to also be careful what I say about Felicity Goodyear-Smith. I see her as a very critical person in this whole scenario. I say in my book that she hasn't been honest about her involvement in Centrepoint, and she still plays has a professional role in that field. We had the satanic panic in New Zealand and also around the world. So recovered memory is, it's kind of tied in with the satanic panic. So I'm kind of, it's a tricky one. It's pretty complex because Felicity Goodyear-Smith and her cronies or supporters and Centrepoint apologists going on about the sexual abuse industry, including her husband, who was a convicted Centrepoint abuser. So that's one side of the spectrum, and then of course you've got the believers in satanic ritual abuse and recovered memory, and that's just as wrong, from my understanding as well, right? I'm not sure if that answers your question, but all these things have definitely come into play as well, I think, back then. Does that help? I hope. But it is a pretty complex topic. I can probably only give so much on that right here now. Yeah.
I think we have time for one more.
Thank you, Anke. Fantastic. I identify so much with what you've said. Have you got any comments about the loss of family?
Oh,
and,
of course.
The distancing of family and
Of course. Yeah, very much. Especially so, Gloriavale is one extreme because once you leave or you get kicked out, people also get basically thrown out overnight. They lose everything because there's shunning, and that also happens with other religious groups like the Jehovah's Witnesses or Exclusive Brethren. So it's not just unique to Gloriavale, but that is brutal. So people don't just lose everything, the life they've known. They don't even know how to use an FPOS card. They don't know how to drive a car. They've never been really on the outside, and they have no more contact to their family, and so that is brutal. And then there's also and with Centrepoint it was different because they didn't really have didn't practice shunning, but what I've seen there, because now we can look at 20 years later, right? We don't have that yet with Gloriavale. So what I see there is the absolute, the way that it has destroyed families over the years of parents who are still in denial of what happened to their children, who haven't found a way to apologize for bringing their children into Centrepoint, who's still telling their adult children that it was good for what actually happened to them and it was just the police and the media who got it all wrong. There are families where you have abusers and victims in the same family. Families where kids are, where kids back then, adults, no, the worst trauma from them was not being sexually abused, but seeing headlines where their parents' names were on the way to school, being called a dirty commie kid when they went to school, or the trauma that came from being stigmatized. So, yes, families and cults is such a big topic, and there's so much grief there and so much pain there. And I really hope that we're going to see better educated, specialized counselors in New Zealand who understand these dynamics and can help people around that, especially around family and the pain of that. Yeah.
Because it's a really heart-rending bit in your book, I can't remember whether it's Louise or Angie from Centrepoint, but her mother believed she wanted somewhere where she could go so the kids would be taken care of, because you had a situation where she's overwhelmed trying to look after her kids, and I think there's questions to ask the state there as well.
Absolutely, yeah. It's my pet issue that I think New Zealand needs, like other countries needs a state-funded, government-run, non-religious anti-cult agency for prevention and education and also counselling, like we have it with drug abuse or sexual abuse. Really need it. Yeah.
I think that's us. It's 1:30.
Oh, thank you.
All that remains is to thank you. Anke Richter,
you.
Thank you so much for your time and for your generosity. The book is out the first week of November. It's in all good bookshops, but you can put your name down for it at the table outside the door, and you'll be signing book plates.
Yes, I can sign book plates so you can put them. I only just learned this morning what a book plate is from my friend, because when we realized the books hadn't arrived, she said, just get book plates, and so we can put them inside your books. And so they should actually still be hopefully be announced a little bit earlier than nationwide, because they were supposed to be here today. So if you're lucky, you have them already next week.
A world exclusive. Please join me in thanking Anke Richter.